Saudi Arabia has a new message for Iran as it continues to blame the country for an attack on its oil facilities. The Saudi Minister of State for Foreign Affairs tells CNN the kingdom would consider the strikes an act of war if an international investigation finds they were launched from Iranian soil.
We want Iran to behave like a normal nation. We want Iran to stop being a revolution and be a nation state. We want Iran to stop interfering in the affairs of other countries and supporting terrorist groups, and we want them to stop providing ballistic missiles to terrorist groups, and we want them to make sure that they are never in a position to acquire a nuclear weapon. We want them to be good neighbors. We want to have good relations with Iran. We want to trade with them. But we can't do this if all we get from them is death and destruction. For 40 years, we have tried to extend our hand in friendship to the Iranians, and all we got was death and destruction.
And right now, their top politicians, President Rouhani, the Foreign Minister Zarif, are going to be in New York. What value are the conversations they have if they don't represent the country?
I think that the Iranians need to hear a united and a firm message from the international community that this behavior is not acceptable and this behavior must stop.
But they've heard that message before, haven't they? They've heard that very loudly.
They need to hear it more, and there needs to be action. Appeasement with Iran does not work. For example, trying to set up a parallel financial payment system is appeasement. Trying to give them a line of credit is appeasement. It just emboldens them. The Iranians have to know that there will be consequences to their actions.
But their message has been behavior and changes towards Iran, like the United States pulling out of the JCPOA, the joint nuclear deal, to try to get a better deal, to try to get control of ballistic missiles, to try to push the timeline and all those horizons. Has that blown up and backfired? Because what we've seen is, from your assessment, the hardliners are on the rise and more aggressive behavior, and you're suffering for it.
Iran is feeling the pressure of the sanctions, no doubt.
But you're feeling the heat of their pressure. This attack on your country, if you're right that Iran did this, you're feeling the heat of that pressure.
Yeah, but we do not engage in appeasement. We will do whatever it takes to protect our country and our citizens and our residents and our facilities, and we will work with our allies in order to ensure that this happens.
Are we on the threshold of a military response, do you believe?
We don't want war. The US doesn't want war, but it's really up to the Iranians. If they keep continuing along this path, then they risk the possibility of military action. But nobody wants war. Everybody wants to resolve this peacefully, and the end result has to be an end to Iran's aggressive policies.
I don't see the difference at the moment, if you don't mind me saying, of Iran producing these weapons and then waiting for an investigation to find out where they were fired from, because surely it all amounts to the same thing, that you're going to come to the same point. Eventually, are you playing for time by saying that we're investigating right now when you perhaps have a very strong inclination?
No, we hold Iran responsible because the missiles and the drones that were fired at Saudi Arabia, not only against Geik and Horeis, but also from Yemen, were Iranian-built and Iranian-delivered missiles, so we hold them responsible. But to launch an attack from your territory, if that is the case, puts it in a different category.
What's the different category?
This would be considered an act of war.
We'll have more from Nick Robertson's interview later in our program. Meanwhile, Iran is pushing back against U.S. pressure after Washington said it would send troops to Saudi Arabia to help defend the kingdom. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says Tehran will not allow anyone to violate its borders. He was speaking at a ceremony in Tehran marking the start of Iran's war with Iraq, where he warned against the presence of foreign forces in the region.
The security of the Persian Gulf is intra-regional. The security of the Strait of Hormuz is intra-regional. Foreign forces can cause problems and insecurity for our people and for our region.
Mr. Rouhani is set to take part in the UN General Assembly this week in New York. He said Iran would inform the Assembly of a plan for securing the Gulf with the help of other nations. Let's talk more about these developments with our guest, Bobby Ghosh. He's an editor and editorial board member at Bloomberg News. He joins me live from London. Thank you so much, Mr. Ghosh, for being with us. First up, do you get a sense of a drumbeat of war? We just heard from Saudi Arabia, we heard from Iran, but do you get a sense of any drumbeat of war between these two countries over this attack in Saudi Arabia?
Well, most of the noise about war is coming from the Iranians. We just heard the Saudi foreign minister trying to make sort of almost making excuses not to go to war. From the American side, we've heard the Trump administration say repeatedly that they don't want a war and that they would like negotiations. But from the Iranian side, we're seeing missiles and we're seeing talk of war. The Iranian foreign minister today refused to rule out the possibility of war. So it seems like that a couple of months ago, it seemed like both sides were being quite bellicose, and the rhetoric looked like it was rising to the level of that we saw before the war in Iraq. But now it seems that the U.S. especially, and the Saudis to some degree, are being far more cautious in their response to these attacks, whereas Iran is becoming more provocative, and the rhetoric from that side is more warlike.
So how does the increase in military might by the U.S. Affect the situation? Does it help ratchet up the threat or prevent it? And do you expect at any point a military response by Saudi Arabia if they do conclude this attack came from an Iranian base?
Well, I would be quite surprised if the Saudis launched a military strike on Iran. That would be a level of aggression that would basically inflame the entire region. The American presence there is always tricky because it is not necessarily popular, certainly not popular with Iranians, and it's not always popular with ordinary Saudis. So it's a balance that the U.S. has to strike. But at the same time, we've seen that the Saudis have failed to protect their own oil installations. And we have to remember this is not just an attack on Saudi Arabia. This is an attack on the global economic system. The Saudis are the world's largest suppliers, and that particular installation in Abqaiq is their biggest installation. It took 50% of Saudi oil supply, that is 6% of the global oil supply, offline. It created a huge spike in oil prices that affects everybody. Every country in the world that uses oil was affected by that strike. So it's not, at the simplest level, it is an attack by Iran directly or using proxies on Saudi Arabia. But at a higher altitude, this is something that affects the whole of the world. And the United States apparently is taking the position that it has interest in protecting Saudi oil facility. It has economic interests as well as political interests. And that's why it is trying to help the Saudis protect those facilities from these kinds of attacks.
Well, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi calls the arms sales and troop deployments outrageous. She went on to say Americans are weary of war and have no interest in entering another Middle East conflict, particularly on behalf of Saudi Arabia. How would this look for President Trump if something were to happen here?
Well, so it's a very fine balance he's walking. Trump, remember, is a person who came to the White House promising no more wars, promising to withdraw American troops to reduce America's footprint in the Middle East. And here he's finding himself raising or increasing that footprint, raising the number of American troops that are in that region. So this is not necessarily going to be very popular with his base. And this is a president who, first and foremost, seems to care about his base. And so this is going to be quite tricky for him. On the one hand, he needs to send the Iranians a signal that their behavior will not be tolerated. On the other hand, he can't afford a war. So it is a very, very fine balance that everybody is walking.
Well, he did send a signal via new sanctions. We'll see the effect that those will have. We appreciate your insights on this, Bobby Ghosh for us from Bloomberg. Thanks so much.
Anytime, Natalie.
Well, as we've been reporting, Saudi Arabia says it would consider the attack on its oil facilities an act of war if an international investigation finds the strikes were launched from Iran. That message comes from the Saudi Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, and he spoke about it with CNN's Nick Robertson. Here's more of Nick's interview.
The United States is sending a few hundred troops here, missile batteries. Is that really enough to guarantee 100% protection for all your vulnerable sites?
The United States and Saudi Arabia are close allies when it comes to the defense relationship, and I believe the United States sending equipment now. The details of this are really with our Ministry of Defense, but I believe that the situation will be assessed on a continual basis and adjustments made when needed.
Iran seems to detect that Saudi Arabia is in a weak position. The foreign minister there, Javad Zarif, said, in effect, that Saudi Arabia was willing to fight Iran down to the last US soldier. That implies he thinks you can't stand up to them by yourself.
No, it confirms that he's said many outrageous and outlandish things and frankly laughable things. Saudi Arabia and the United States have been allies for 80 years. We have fought many wars together. We have spilled blood. Your blood and our blood together. Saudi Arabia always carries its weight. Saudi Arabia and the United States are not reckless when it comes to wars. When war is the last resort, it's the Iranians who are reckless in engaging in such behavior.
Javad Zarif says that that Iran isn't responsible for the attack, that he's willing to talk to Saudi Arabia. What do you say to him?
He and other Iranian officials have said a lot of things that are frankly not correct, if not outright lies. And so to say that they are not responsible for this or didn't do it is outrageous.
But if they're saying that, then potentially they could do this again. What happens then?
So, well, with regards to what they're saying, so either Mr. Zarif is not telling the truth, or he's not aware of what his government is doing, the other side of his government is doing.
What do you think? Do you think they are split?
We know that there is a part of the Iranian government that projects an image of wanting to talk to the world, but they don't seem to have influence. And there's another part of the government that wants to expand the revolution and take over the region, and they don't want to talk. And so it's like two faces of the same coin. From our perspective,
from your assessment, who is winning that at the moment in Iran?
I can't establish this for a fact, but what we have seen is that Iran's aggressive behavior has increased, not decreased. Iran's threats to the region and to world energy supplies have increased, not decreased.
So the hardliners are on the rise in Iran.
It appears so.
Nick Robertson there in that interview. Well, another Kennedy could take a seat in the U.S. Senate.